Hey everybody, I'm back with another ranking video, and this time I'm turning my sights on the 90s. So in this video I'm going to be ranking 16 books released by Stephen King between 1990 and 1999. I'm going to leave out a couple. I'm not going to include the self-published collection 6 Stories, which was a paperback original signed by King, published by Philtrum Press. I'm not going to include it because I don't have it, for one thing. And for another thing, the stories went on to be collected in other places, and it's more of a boutique item. I'm also not going to include, although I really thought about it, Storm of the Century, which was published in hardcover and in trade paperback in a screenplay format. Even though it's a cool story, it made for a cool TV movie. Because it's a screenplay, I'm not going to include it in this list. I thought about it. I went back and forth on it, but I decided ultimately to leave it out. So that leaves 16 other books, and I will go ahead and get started. We'll work in reverse order from the bottom. So coming in at number 16, it's no surprise because I've already gone on the record as saying that this is my least favorite Stephen King book of all time. So of course it comes in at the bottom of the list of the decade it was published. And that is Rose Madder. I think that there was a really interesting, really brutal, honest story inside this book that then was completely undermined by the way that the whole thing kind of goes off the rails and ultimately kind of turns into a strange cartoon. The villain of the piece just gets so utterly ridiculous it's almost laughable, and I think there's a lot of potential here. I cared about Rose Madder, I cared about the book, and I think that's why it stings so bad, because I feel like I can see what this book could have been. But anyway, number 16, I'm going to put Rose Madder. And I recognize that it may be unfair to stack collections up against novels, because the shorter the work, the less chance, arguably, it has to make a lasting impact. But I think that there are some overall excellent collections, and like Different Seasons, for instance. Different Seasons, 4 excellent pieces, and overall the cumulative effect, that book stacks up against anything else that Stephen King has ever published. The 4 novellas individually would stack up and be contenders in a list of the greatest Stephen King books of all time. So anyway, I made the decision to include collections for rightly or wrongly, based on the overall impact of the work and how it stacks up in my memory after having read it. So coming in at number 15, probably my least favorite collection of all, 4 Past Midnight. So this was the result of just a really rough time in Stephen King's creative life after he got sober and tried to rekindle his writing muse. He went through a phase where he said everything he tried to write fell apart like wet tissue paper. And the 4 stories in 4 Past Midnight don't fall apart, but neither are they particularly inspired or classics. The best of the bunch, in my opinion, is The Library Policeman, and even it has some flaws. The Langoliers is probably the most famous of the bunch because it was made into a TV movie, and you know, it's okay. Secret Window, I think it's very derivative of The Dark Half, and The Sundog, it just was very frustrating. It felt like a 5-page short story stretched out to dozens upon dozens upon dozens of pages, and it just kind of drove me a little crazy. But anyway, coming in at number 15 in my list, ranking the 90s, 4 Past Midnight. Number 14 is a novel. It's listed as a novel that would have fit comfortably in a book in a collection like Four Past Midnight lengthwise. I think it's shorter than most of the pieces in Four Past Midnight, and that is The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. There's nothing wrong with this book. I read it when it first came out, and I was a teenager, and I found it interesting. It was a bit of a diversion to feature a child in this unusual and interesting situation, but it doesn't rise to the level of a Stephen King classic. It is squarely in the camp of Stephen King, pretty good, fine, nothing wrong with it, but it doesn't linger in my imagination. I don't remember everything about it. I just remember reading it and thinking, that's okay. Whatever, moving on. So coming in at number 14, The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. And so this next one, I also thought a lot about this because the Dark Tower is sort of the nexus. It's at the heart of Stephen King's entire life's work. And so taken as a whole, it is a mammoth achievement. But the parts of the series, to me, vary wildly in terms of quality and in terms of just enjoyment ability. And I know that's a personal preference, but coming in at number 13, I know some people just love this book. I was not a fan. I know my collaborator Noah detests The Drawing of the Three. To me, The Drawing of the Three, I loved The Drawing of the Three. It was a whirlwind, it was fast, it was exciting, it was funny, and then The Wastelands comes along and it just kind of, we get down to the business of actually progressing on this literal journey that they're taking toward this thing called the Dark Tower, and a lot of it takes place in Roland's world, and I just didn't find it as engaging. I think The Drawing of the Three, very little forward momentum happens in terms of the overall story arc, but it was just so much fun. And then when The Wastelands gets down to the business of actually moving them physically along their journey, I'm really looking forward to revisiting the series, and I hope that The Wastelands, that I have a different experience this next time, but it's not one of my favorites, and it comes in at number 13 in my list ranking the 90s. So then right above Wastelands, I put Stephen King's other big behemoth collection of the 90s, and that's Nightmares and Dreamscapes. There's some good stuff in here, don't get me wrong. I think Stephen King intended this book to sort of be a summing up, like a clearinghouse. So everything prior to this, all the short pieces that he had written that he deemed good enough to republish and collect, they all ended up in Nightmares and Dreamscapes. This is a mammoth book, just almost depthless in terms of value for your money and quality. It's not a particularly hard one to find, not particularly expensive even now, but just, and while there is some good stuff, the cumulative effect is almost overwhelming. So unlike a collection like Night Shift or Skeleton Crew, where the individual pieces really linger in the memory, Nightmares and Dreamscapes just keeps going, and it's an embarrassment of riches, but the sum, it's almost less than the sum of its parts, if that makes any sense. But anyway, coming in at number 12, Nightmares and Dreamscapes. At number 11, I put Stephen King's Richard Bachman novel of the 90s, so 10 years or so after Stephen King was outed as Richard Bachman. Some saw it as a shameless publicity stunt. On the same day in 1996, he released Desperation by Stephen King and The Regulators by Richard Bachman. And this is one that I only read for the first time in the last couple of years, and I liked it a lot more than I thought I was going to. It was funnier than I thought it was going to be. It had more to say about like social satire. It had a lot to say about our dependence on technology, and I liked it. I really did. We are getting into an area of the list where there's nothing particularly wrong with any of these books. It's just depending on what they are ranked against. And I put Regulators at number 11 on my list of the 90s. So coming in at number 10, I put The Last Castle Rock Story, Needful Things. This book is not without its flaws. I think it is overstuffed, it is overwritten, too long, all of the typical criticisms that can get leveled at Stephen King could apply to Needful Things. And I was kind of torn between where to rank this or The Regulators. It could have gone either way. But I put Needful Things, I give it the edge over The Regulators because it is, I can tell, and I know from interviews and things that I've read after the fact, that Stephen King had a good time writing this novel. He intended it to be funny, and I think reading the book, maybe some of that humor doesn't come across. I've heard some people say that this is one of their favorites, and I've heard people say that they absolutely can't stand this book. But I did the audiobook version, which is read by Stephen King, and I found it very engaging, very enjoyable, very funny. Nobody knows these characters better than him, and there's a preacher character, especially like a televangelist type character, hilarious. And the humor, the intention of Stephen King while he was writing this book, I think comes through in the audiobook performance that he does himself reading the book. Anyway, it's not a classic. It's kind of like Christine. I think that was the book where he infamously described himself as like the literary equivalent of a Big Mac. Needful Things is one of those Big Mac novels. But, sometimes you're not in the mood for hoity-toity filet mignon and you just want something filling and tasty and greasy, and Needful Things definitely fits that bill. So at number 9, I'm going to put Stephen King's second book for Scribner, Hearts in Atlantis. This is a really unique collection, and it has two main pieces. No pun intended, two MAIN pieces. The one that's fiction sort of inspired, I would say, by Stephen King's childhood, and then the other one, which is very, very clearly autobiographical about Stephen King's experience in college. And then the collection is rounded out by some directly or indirectly related, very short pieces that don't really linger in the memory. So it has those two main parts, and I enjoyed both of those pieces very much, especially the one where Stephen King, Hearts in Atlantis, where he's writing about his time in college. I found that to be very engaging, very moving, very interesting, and very enjoyable. So there's overall, the lion's share of the content of Hearts in Atlantis is really interesting, high quality stuff. And it comes in at number 9. That number 8 is a book that I first read when I was a kid and really enjoyed. And then I read it again just a few months ago and really enjoyed it again. And that is Insomnia. Now this is another big, huge, arguably overwrought and overwritten book. Stephen King wrote the book while he himself was suffering from insomnia, and then I guess originally deemed that it was not publishable. And somewhere between that original idea that this isn't publishable to the point where it got published, he changed his mind and decided to put it out. I think the book, the characterizations are really vivid, and I found myself really caring about the characters. And just as it did when I first read it, there's a lot of social things that are like ripped from the headlines in Insomnia, and it's even more more relevant today than it was when it was first written. And I found that engaging. The mystery at the heart of the piece is engaging. The characters are engaging, and it doesn't make a lot of sense, but then it kind of is explained what's going on, and then there's a freedom. Like, it doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't make a lot of sense to the characters. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense at times to Stephen King, but that's okay, because there are greater powers at play, and you go along for the ride. And I recognize that this is not classic literature, but I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it when I first read it, and I enjoyed it now, well over 2 decades later. It holds up, and it comes in at number 8 on my list. So at number 7, I'm gonna put the twin to The Regulators. So Richard Bachman published The Regulators in 1996, and Stephen King published its evil twin on the same day, and that is Desperation. I first read this book in the 90s, pretty soon after it came out, and it was scary and engaging, and I really like the Stephen King writes a lot about Maine, and I thought that this was kind of a refreshing change of pace to have a book set kind of in the wild and woolly West. And I look forward. It's next on my list of my great Stephen King reread. I want to go back and reread Desperation because I have a lot of fond memories of it, and I'm really looking forward to revisiting it and seeing if it holds up. But anyway, number 7 on my list. And number 6, I put Bag of Bones, Stephen King's first novel for Scribner. This was kind of a critical turning point in his career, where he made a bid for serious respect, and I feel like he got it. I found this book to be very spooky, very haunting, very engaging, very sexy. There's a lot of content, like bodice ripping, sexual content in this novel, which I found to be very unique for Stephen King, but he handles it well. There's a lot of passion. Passion's definitely flair. The scene itself, the scenery, the setting is very vividly portrayed. It's another book that has connections to Derry, which is always welcome. I enjoy Derry even more than Castle Rock. It's the ultimate Stephen King city in my opinion. And I just really liked Bag of Bones. I thought it was a good piece of work, and it comes in at number 6 on my list. So like I mentioned before, the 90s is kind of a strange decade. So Stephen King started the 90s in kind of a creative funk after having gotten sober, and there's some of his not well regarded, and rightfully so, material comes in the 90s, but he also took a lot of chances, and he tried some new things, and he challenged himself, I feel like, to grow as an artist. And I find that very exciting, and I find it very rewarding. And even though I debated whether or not to put Bag of Bones higher, I ultimately decided to put it out of the top 5 in favor of what comes next. So at number 5, I put Dolores Claiborne. So talk about a challenge. Talk about setting yourself a difficult challenge as a writer, and then meeting it resoundingly. So the entire book is a monologue, basically one character telling a story, like verbally telling a story, and this is that story. I found Dolores to be believable and engaging, and I liked her. The story was gripping, the way that how resourceful she is and what she does to overcome the situation, I found believable and gripping. There's a couple of strange missteps where she refers to characters that show up in Insomnia, and there's a couple of things, like cultural things, where she references characters that I don't feel like she probably would have known or had in her repertoire. But overall, I mean, those are tiny little nitpicky points, but I found Dolores Claiborne to be refreshing and a delight. And its counterpart book comes in at number 4, Gerald's Game. So I couldn't help but think of other types of popular entertainment that took challenges like this. And the one that comes to mind immediately is Rear Window by Alfred Hitchcock, the film. So the whole thing takes place in basically one location, predominantly takes place inside one apartment. That was a very unusual decision to make, and it was very challenging, but Alfred Hitchcock enjoyed that challenge and enjoyed telling that story in that way with those limitations in place. And Gerald's Game, one character handcuffed to a bed, basically like within the first 15 or 20 pages, she's alone. At least in terms of living things around her, she is alone. And she spends basically the entire novel in that desperate situation, which gets more desperate as time goes on. And in spite of this limitation, perhaps because of it, Stephen King just pulls out all the stops, and it's a creative tour de force, I feel like. Another novel with a credible female protagonist, at least credible in my opinion, very engaging story, and it does share some connections with Dolores Claiborne, which I feel like are a little bit forced in both books, but definitely not deal breakers. I talked about it, Gerald's Game and Dolores Claiborne as well, in my list of the most underrated Stephen King books, and I hold to that. I feel like Dolores and Gerald, in the grand scheme of things, aren't as famous, aren't as well known, and they deserve to be, because I think they are both exceptional pieces of work. So number 5, Dolores Claiborne. Number 4, Gerald's Game. Top 3, this was a challenge for me because there are 3 iconic works, 2 of them I think iconic outside the realm of Stephen King fans, the constant readers, the collectors, but one of them I consider to be just an absolute masterpiece in Stephen King's entire bibliography. But coming in at number 3, the top 3, this was a challenge, but coming in at number 3, I'm going to put The Green Mile. So The Green Mile was originally published in 6 parts and in a serial format, and according to legend, Stephen King, when the first edition was the first volume was released, he wasn't done with the story. He was writing it, it was getting published, and he didn't know where it was going to go or how it was going to end. And whether or not that's true, the book holds together remarkably well and is sort of a spiritual cousin to Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption, in that it has a similar era and a similar setting. And this one, it has some gruesome moments, some scary moments. It will make you cry. It made me cry. I sat down, and for the first time in my life, I think I was 13 or 14 years old, I sat down one day for like 8 hours and read pretty much the entire novel in one sitting. And I was drained, and I was exhilarated, and I was bleary-eyed, and it just has some real moments of tenderness and beauty. And this is one of those books that people may be familiar with. They're certainly familiar with the movie that starred Tom Hanks, and they may not realize that it's based on something that Stephen King wrote, and I thoroughly enjoy it. It comes in, for me, this was a tough one, but it comes in at number 3 on my list of ranking the 90s. So this is another tricky one too. There are 2 versions of this book, 2 very famous versions of this very, very famous book, and I don't quite know what to do with either one of them. But I'm talking about The Stand. So in my video ranking the 70s, I almost dismiss the original version of The Stand as being superfluous, because the complete and uncut edition is the edition that Stephen King preferred. It was his like director's cut of the novel, and it's much closer to what we could have gotten in the 70s if Doubleday had allowed Stephen King's original manuscript to be published. This is not the original manuscript. It was revised and edited, and not everything that he originally cut out was put back in, but he has not gone back and released yet another updated version. So this is it. This is the ultimate and definitive, at least to Stephen King, version of The Stand. And The Stand, to a lot of people, is Stephen King's absolute #1 with a bullet masterpiece, #1 book of all time. And I used to count myself in that group. Honestly, I first read this book when I was in college, and I loved it. It was gripping, and it really was my favorite novel for a lot of years. But I've gotten older, and I've read plenty of other things, and over the years, just recently in the last couple of years, I went back and read the 1978 version, and I found that experience to be a little tedious, and it caused my basic assumption of where The Stand fits in the overall Stephen King canon, at least in terms of quality. It caused my preconceptions to falter a little bit, and I haven't gone back. I haven't felt interested or motivated to go back and reread the complete and uncut version. But suffice it to say, I don't think it ends up in my top 5 overall, and it doesn't take the top spot in the 90s. The 1978 version, didn't take the top spot in my list of the 70s, and this version, even though it's definitive and I consider it to be the better version of the book, doesn't take the top spot in the 90s. And that bothers me. I feel like for something that I used to hold in such high esteem, I don't know where I lost the magic. But anyway, it still comes in at #2, because if this is the definitive version, I feel like it needs to get ranked. If you're going to rank the decades, it needs to get ranked in the 90s as the definitive ultimate edition of this very famous novel. So I put it at #2. And if you've been following along, and sort of by process of elimination, then you know what takes the top spot. So as much as I really didn't care for The Wastelands, I was not looking forward to book 4 of the Dark Tower series, Wizard and Glass. The Wastelands ends on a cliffhanger, which I knew that Wizard and Glass would have to resolve. It's longer than The Wastelands, and I was ready to just admit that maybe the Dark Tower as an entity wasn't for me. But I got into Wizard and Glass. It was engaging. I've mentioned in another video, it came along at a time when I had just suffered a big breakup in my life, and I was feeling very sad and very woe is me and very sorry for myself. And something about the white-hot and ultimately tragic love affair at the heart of Wizard and Glass really resonated with me. I'm looking forward to doing the entire Dark Tower series again, and we'll see if Wizard and Glass holds up, or if it was just an example of, this is exactly the book that I needed at that particular moment in my life. But in my memory, in retrospect, I remember being just amazed at the scope of it, how it all holds together, the language of it. I found it to be beautifully written. So while it doesn't do much to actually move the quartet closer to the Dark Tower, farther along on their journey, it is tremendously valuable in giving some backstory and some context and some history on Roland and how he became who he became. He is kind of like a machine when you first meet him, single-minded, cold, seemingly uncaring, and wizarding glass is when you realize that he has loved and lost, and he has cared deeply, and he has this whole tragic backstory that I think is really interesting. You get to learn how he became a gunslinger in the first place, but all that can't hold a candle to the love story at the heart of this book, and it just blew me away. I read it over the course of several days while I was nursing my broken heart, and it was exciting, it was suspenseful, it was scary, but it really made me do a lot of crying because I just found it to be very romantic, and there's enough foreshadowing that happens in the earlier books that you kind of know that this book is not going to have a happy ending. And in a lot of ways, it reminded me of like watching Titanic for the first time. You get deeply involved in this love story and you hope for the best, but in the back of your head, there's this little voice that's like, you know how this is going to end. You know it's not going to end well. But ultimately, that makes the impact of it all the deeper, I think. And I can't wait to read this book again on my return journey to the Dark Tower. But as of right now, even though it's been years since I've read it, I hold it in such high esteem that I put it in my #1 spot of the 16 major works that Stephen King published in the 90s. So thanks very much for coming on this journey with me. The 90s, in retrospect, is probably not one of Stephen King's more iconic decades. I think it pales in comparison overall to the 70s and to the 80s, but it's a really interesting decade overall. He took some stylistic chances. I think he showed a lot of growth. It was the decade that he switched publishers and ended up at Scribner, where he has been ever since. And there's some not great things in the 90s, but there's also some true masterpieces from the 90s as well. So let me know what you think. What's your favorite book of the 90s? What would your top 5 be from that decade? Just any ideas you have, any thoughts you have, I'd love to read them. So feel free to share them in the comments. I appreciate your support. I appreciate your time, and wherever you are, I hope you have a great rest of your day. I will talk to you later. Bye.